Hello, and welcome to another edition of Close Mode, the Enterprise Sales Show. I'm Brian Dietmeyer, CEO of Close Strong, the home of precision guided selling. And today I'm excited to be here with Jeremy Park. And Jeremy is the Senior Sales Enablement Manager at Airbase. And Jeremy's got a cool background. You and I were talking about this the other day. He's degree in nutrition. He's also a trainer. Has been an account executive and a firefighter. So he's what I referred to as a poet warrior, like a little bit of everything. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Airbase, they lead the spend management category with their all-in-one platform to support complex workflows, payments, and accounting of all non-payroll spend. That being said, Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Brian.
So, as I understand it, your wife plans to watch this recording and critique maybe us both. So we'll see what we can give her in terms of content to pick on us for.
Yeah, she loves any chance to one up me for sure. So this is gonna be a good one.
We'll do our best to give her some material. So our topic today, of course, is sales enablement. And last week, you and I were having a discussion about like effective and ineffective sales enablement approaches, and you had some insight I want to explore. But first, just in our casual chat, you were telling me how you got your first sales job, and most of us here that are listening, watching, live in sales somewhere. And I loved the story. Can you tell me about pressing two?
Yeah, happy to give you kind of a expedited version of last week. So, I think there's a lot of people who are generally interested in sales. They may have also they might also have differing viewpoints of what sales actually encompasses. I definitely come from what I would consider non-traditional background, started at the age of 26 in software sales. As you mentioned, my education's in nutrition, pre-med. Won't get into the gap between that and my sales career, but really got my start because I wanted to make some money. Like a lot of folks, startups here, I'm based in the Denver area. We're really starting to pick up locally. And I started following up with all the resumes I was submitting by cold calling the companies. And normally it's, hey, this is company A, press one for service, press two for sales. And I pressed two for sales and ended up speaking with the VP of sales who had just been hired on 3 months earlier and told me, hey, listen, why don't you come on in, interview with me? I need people like you doing exactly what you just did. So that's how I got my start in sales, was from the bottom. And since then, I've been a seller at 5 different companies and now in enablement.
I love that story, and you and I are going to weave into discovery and what that process means to you, and I kind of connect that back. But again, for any of us who have sold, pressing two and happening to get the VP of sales and getting a job is really cool. It's like the holy grail of selling. So let's go back to sales enablement. You mentioned last week that for some, sales enablement's becoming a reactive and administrative. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sales enablement, it's not so. Just as context, I didn't have a sales enablement function to rely on for more than half the companies I was selling at. And I think that a lot of sales enablement practitioners would agree when I say a lot of companies define it in different ways. So
Yeah.
when you're like, hey, what do you do around enablement? You're going to get a slightly different response. In my experience, what I've uncovered is that a lot of sales enablement can be used as reactive measures, whereas really ideally it should be strategic. The
Yeah.
background I come from is largely early stage VC backed high growth startups. And in that realm, what a lot of companies are striving to accomplish is to achieve repeatability so that they can actually scale. And far too often, I find that enablement was used tactically to plug smaller holes when there might be bigger holes in the ship. And so it doesn't, and when you change too often, as you can start to see when you walk that story down the line, you actually can't create any repeatability. There's no
Yeah.
foundation from which you build.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that unfortunately is a reality.
yeah, and Jeremy, that leads me into the next question. So, yeah, what is the kind of desired state if we know that sort of reactive and administrative is not really where we want to be? How would you describe the desired state of that more strategic function?
Yeah, and I think so. Let me preface this by saying that obviously organizations are really complex. There's a lot of different dynamics going
Yeah.
on. And especially if you're in a competitive market, I think there is a natural need to make pivots on the fly. You have to make changes, otherwise you're going to die as a business. But a few of the things that I think sales enablement, well, it's a few of the things that you need in order for sales enablement to be really effective, I believe, is one, believing that it is truly a strategic function.
Yeah.
I think you want to rely on try as best you can. I think data is an issue for a lot of companies, especially the hygiene, but where you can make data back decisions. I think similar to the healthy tension that exists between sales and marketing, you might also want to consider that for sales enablement and sales, where if you because if you think about how folks are incentivized, you don't want to just you don't want to just play into sales leadership incentives for short term fast growth. Sales enablement should be thinking longer term because,
Yeah.
again, typically you want that repeatability factor. Very closely tied to that, I think not every organization necessarily establishes an enablement charter. That might be a good place to start because then you can really start to align with key stakeholders on what's the purpose, what's the structure, and what are the guiding principles behind enablement that you can continue to refer back to so that you can make principle based decisions. I think that would be a really fantastic place to start.
Yep. So we're cool. That's helpful and clarifies for me. And we're gonna kind of make a transition to more tactical because you and I dove into some. Yeah. All right. So separative. We have to be a more strategic function. You talked a little bit about leaders talking to reps in sort of broad strokes, like you need to do more discovery. You need to broaden your footprint in the account. And what do you see as the problem or the issue with that?
Well, for one, I think that sales leaders, like most leaders, have really good intent. But when you give feedback in really broad strokes, my experience has been that it's not very constructive. It doesn't provide a clear path, clear, tangible targets for reps on the field to actually advance their career.
Yeah.
And some of the most common things, and we'll probably get into it, is you're sitting in a deal room where you're reviewing your top deals. Maybe this is a public forum where you have multiple other sellers and sales leaders in the same room, and your CRO, VP of sales, is picking apart your deal and ultimately concludes that, okay, you just did not do good enough discovery. And
Right.
hey, the compelling event here is non existent. You need to do this. Hey, you need to multi thread here. And I think a lot of reps leaving that room don't really know how to put that into practice.
Right. Right.
And that directly conflicts with the VP of sales goal, which is, to drive revenue as fast as possible to create this repeatable engine. So yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting, and this is related but unrelated. Years ago, I have a friend who's a Western trained psychologist and a Buddhist monk, so pretty cool background. Which is kind of why I said I liked your background of mixed it up. But she said to me once, like, this is probably 20 years ago, like you should meditate more. And that sounded right to me, but I ended up telling her like 15 years later, when you said that to me, I got it, but I didn't know how to do it. And so when you told me
Mm.
that story last week, I kind of went, that's where the nickel dropped for me to just go, yeah, well, maybe I would have been doing it if I knew how. You and I wandered a little bit into methodologies, and I want to go like to discovery, for example. And I don't want to paraphrase you, but what I heard was something along the lines of like, methodologies are not really solving the discovery problem. And I'll tell you from interviewing a lot of folks, almost everyone has had kind of training and they're still troubled with discovery. So what's your sort of view on methodologies relating to discovery specifically?
I think so having been at 5 different companies, there's some parallels, there's some overlap, and then there's some new frameworks that I was introduced to. Overarchingly, they're all really helpful and they
Yeah.
all have some truth behind it. I
Yep.
think the gap behind frameworks and methodologies is that that's all they are. It's a framework and it's a methodology, but you still need to help, for example, bring awareness to the table. And that's at an individual level. And then secondarily, you need to show constructive paths to not only, again, become aware, but cover those gaps. And the methodologies don't really solve for that. Methodologies are a really good way to check a box and say you did or didn't.
Yeah.
But I think that there's this really big gap around, okay, so now that we know there's opportunities for improvement, for example, improve your ability to identify compelling event. How do you actually do that? What are
Right.
the mechanics behind it? And they don't address it
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
large part.
No, and I've heard this a lot. It's the what and the how, right? And it's kind of like we talked about with discovery, with meditation. It's like, yeah, okay, get me into the weeds about for me as an individual. How do I do that? And so one of the reasons I'm digging into discovery is I know you have a passion for it, and I love this was like illustrative to me. Last week you said discovery is kind of like dating. Connect discovery and dating for me because it intuitively makes sense to me. But yeah, flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. I have a fairly strong point of view on this, and it all comes from past failures, to be honest, and trying to do exactly what a lot of these VPs sales told me to do, which is I need you to do better discovery. I need you to do XYZ. And I didn't really have a path. And so by analyzing top reps and then trying to bring that into my own practice, one of the key things that I think a lot of sales programs miss is look, for most sellers out there, they're not selling for the Oracles, the Googles, the Microsoft. Most of your buyers may not know what your product and service is. And therefore, you can't command and demand, hey, this is the sales process, stick with it or leave it. No, you have to recognize that you're on a first date. And if you don't keep that front and center alongside identifying meaningful pain, trying to identify why now, what's the cost of doing nothing, you're really going to miss the boat. You have to think about how am I building some momentum, some engagement, establishing some credibility so that by the end of the call, you can start positioning next steps. And it's a very fluid positioning that leads to an agreement. Yes, Jeremy, would absolutely love to meet with you next week at this time to do this thing.
Yeah. Yeah, the point you make about and I hadn't thought of this until you said it. It's different when you have a $20 billion brand behind you and you're doing discovery. And I learned that painfully. I was with Marriott for 17 years, and I think it was a $15 billion company when I left. And when I walked into a room, I was at VP level, and I got a certain, whether it was customers or competitors, a certain amount of acknowledgement. And when I went out on my own, all that went away. And when you said that to me the other day, like I never connected that for those of us who are selling at startups, that kind of thing, that, yeah, you don't have that horsepower. You don't have, and with the dating analogy, it's like, if all that person's friends know you, then that's the equivalent of a $15 billion company behind you. You're not starting from scratch. I know Jeremy, I know Brian, but yeah, it's such a valid point. So it makes it even more important, right, for startups to get this right.
Yeah, and by the way, at startups, what ends up happening too is leaders try to demonstrate, hey, here's what I want you to do. So they'll step into a first call with you, they'll try to demonstrate it. But if you're a VP of sales, CRO, whatever, you've been selling for the same software for 15 years, even if buyers don't know your brand, like your company brand, you being an elevated position carries a different level of authority,
Yeah.
and you carry a different swagger. So there's also a disconnect there for reps where they still don't know how to connect. Okay, I see what the VP of sales is doing, but how do I do that?
Right. Yeah. And it's funny you say that because it's like in the past, in my previous company and here, when we talk to people about discovery, the thing that I always come back to is ultimately you've got to adjust that for your own style, and maybe with the style of and the relationship with the person you're talking to, right? It's like, and that's why I feel like we miss it. It's like, how do you turn both of those knobs a little bit? And it's funny, this word's used a lot, but it's so your discovery is authentic.
Actually, that's a critical part of building interest and excitement. People want to work with other people. And, even the way you ask the questions, even the way you position questions, hey, do you sound like you're reading a script, which is oftentimes what sales leaders try to do. Hey, draft up for me a list of discovery questions. Those really only work if you somehow internalize, personalize it, and the true authentic self comes out. That takes a lot of honing, a lot of practice, a lot of awareness. And that's where, again, methodologies are great. I'm not, talking crap about them, but you also need to cover some of the more foundational skills
Yeah.
that a lot of training programs aren't addressing today.
Yep. Yeah, my final question has to do with a favorite topic of mine, and I know you have interest too, is EQ. And you and I were just making a connection between the EQ and discovery. I'd love to hear your view on that.
At the end of the day, what's happening is you're trying to work with the stranger who you've again never met, and you if you don't have emotional intelligence, that's okay. I think you can actually develop that, but
Yeah.
it's one of the most critical skills in having what you might otherwise call just a normal human conversation. Buyers want to work with other humans.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of mechanics behind it. But at the end of the day, it's such a complex field, honestly. Sales to me, this is the therapist side of the job where you
Yeah.
come in and you really try to listen to the buyer. That's why, despite having your own internal goals of, hey, I know for the business, I need to identify some meaningful pain. Am I going to qualify this up, move it to the discovery stage? You have your own business interest. You also need to do it in a way where you're not scripted, you're able to pivot on the fly, and that's where I think emotional intelligence really comes in, is picking up on those signals, word and, by the way, nonverbal gestures that
Yes.
you can witness through the screen.
Yeah, and it's I often think the simplest definition of and probably oversimplified is being able to read the room. And if you're reading the room, and you may have said this last week, that we're not selling something to somebody, we're reading the room, and that's what the other human feels. We're leaning into wherever they're at, and that's driving our discovery. And as I understand from people who are pros at this, that's what literally allows people to lean in, to say, oh, this is focused on me. You really do care. You're not just trying to push a solution down my throat. Yeah.
Totally. And probably the one thing I'll say on that topic that's kind of tactical is what I love to help sellers focus on are the vague, subjective statements. One of the key things we really talk about as a sales team is, what is the definition of pain? Because actually, when you read the descriptions in Salesforce around what pain actually constitutes, I would argue most sellers' notes are not pain. If you look at the dictionary definition of what pain means, it means something like emotional suffering. And so anytime I hear terms such as, yeah, that was frustrating, or this wasn't working well, to me, my ears should immediately start flagging up. My EQ should be lighting up, because what you want to ask is, wait, when you said this, what did you mean by that? Can you
Right.
unpack
Right.
that for me? Because that's really where you start getting to the pain of personalized emotional distress, emotional pain that anchors all of the facts of what their process looks like and all the manual work and all of that stuff, which is good, but not pain.
Yeah, and I do think you're right that, like, maybe just like IQ, we all have different levels of EQ, and it can be taught, and I think it's underserved, and that could be a whole other podcast. Is the need, especially for people in sales, but I think any leader, anybody who works in a business, the EQ should be higher, and can be. There are books, you don't even have to take a class, but yeah, you've been super helpful and available to prep for this and do this, and I appreciate your time, your ideas. I really do think of this podcast as a place where people can go to hear what other pros are talking about. These are tough jobs that we do, and it's really nice for people like you to give your time so someone else can go, oh, that's how Jeremy deals with it. So really, really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, of course. I hope folks out in the audience get some value from the content.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.